Welcome to this week's Bible podcast. This week we are looking at the book of First Samuel. Now we have First Samuel and Second Samuel, and also we're going to look at First Kings and Second Kings and First Chronicles and Second Chronicles. Once upon a time, these got divided. Um, Not really sure why. If I was really interested, I'd research that, but I really don't care. But we do have a First Samuel and a Second Samuel. These were believed to have been written around 950 years BCE, before Common Era, before the the common way we keep time. We used to say before Christ, but before Christ and Anno Domini, it doesn't really match up. The historical records show us that Jesus was probably born around 4 BC and probably in the springtime. So the whole before Christ thing doesn't really jive. It's not historically accurate. It's not even uh, accurate within our religious institutions. But anyway, before Common Era, meaning before the current system we have for keeping time. So about 950 years before we started keeping time in the way that we do now. We don't really know who wrote the books of Samuel. It seems logical that Samuel wrote Samuel, but we don't really have evidence or proof of that. Um, a lot of the prophets and leaders actually had scribes who did their writing for them. Um, in some cases, unknown scribes and writers did the work and named it as if the person uh, supposedly writing it actually had more input than they actually did. But when we look at First Samuel, what we start seeing is the beginnings of the monarchy. We see where um, the leaders were Moses, then Aaron. Before that, they were familial leadership. Like Jacob was the leader of Jacob's people. Abraham was the leader of Abraham's people. Um, and so we see that as the way our biblical characters, familial structures were maintained. We do see sometimes where Abraham lived in the land of other rulers, and it had some fear about some of those rulers and did some things perhaps he shouldn't have done. Well, obviously he lied, so those are some things you shouldn't do. Uh, but when we get into uh, the people living in the land, you know, they were captured over and over again by the people around them. The way the Old Testament reads, it reads because those are the people telling the story. It reads that when they turned their back on God, God allowed the people around them to enslave them and capture them. And when they were worshiping God in the true way, then God allowed them to be victorious and take control. I don't really see God as being the person who's in control and in charge of people murdering other people. That just isn't logical. But we have to read the Old Testament as the historical record written by the people who are telling their own stories. So uh, it's autobiographical. It's kind of like um, if you allowed the Republicans to write the the history of America, or you allowed the Democrats to write the history of America, you're not going to get a totally clean piece of work. Okay, so it's kind of the same thing. We're looking at the ancient peoples writing about their own story. So anyway, whoever wrote First Samuel or First and Second Samuel, they really were writing the history, and they're taking us from the time where they had rulers. And in the people's eyes, if we only had a king like these other monarchies around here, then things would be better. That's what we need. That's what we need. And the people kept calling for, they wanted a king, they wanted a leader. And um, so Samuel went out to find the leader. And so uh, he went and found, uh, and you know, I believe Samuel was a person who probably really was praying and seeking the voice of God. Now, the human voices often get in the way of us being able to hear the voice of God. That's still true today. Uh, in theory and theologically, no, that doesn't happen, but it does happen. And so, but I really think that Samuel was trying to do the right thing. And he knew he needed a strong leader that the people would respect, so that the people would just shut up already about finding a king and said, okay, we've got one. Now, focus on something else. And so what we end up seeing is a very strong man, Saul, was anointed to be the king. And uh, the story tells us that Saul was a head above everyone else. Well, how big is that? How big is a head? It's like, I don't know. Here's a ruler. You know, um, that's about a foot, right? So when they say he's a head taller than everyone else, then he was probably a good foot taller than everyone else. I don't. I haven't researched to see what the average height of people were then. You know, the average height now of, if you look at males worldwide, the average height is just under 6 foot. You have some people that are over 6 foot, some people that are under 6 foot. That's not the way it used to be. I think the average height used to be 5'6", 5'7". So if he was a foot over that, then he would be 7'6", something like that. I don't know. So, or uh, if the average, no, sorry, I got that wrong. So if the average person was 5'5", 5'6", then he had been 6'5", 6'6", which, I mean, still, you know, if 6'5" man walks into a room I'm in, we all notice him because he's taller than everybody else there. Now, sometimes you'll be in a big crowded room, there'll be 2 or 3 people that are 6'4", 6'5", but that's kind of the way it was. And so he commanded attention just by walking in the room because he was so tall. Okay. All right. So when we look at, uh, they wanted this strong leader, courageous, and that's what they got. You know, sometimes they say, be careful what you ask for because you might get it. And so that's kind of what happened here. Maybe that's a lesson to be learned here from the story of Saul. Saul had problems, though. He suffered depression and anxiety. Um, if we had the luxury of actually living in the same times with Saul, we could go and investigate and talk with him about that. Uh, if you read in the Bible, taking the whole Old Testament, you will see where Saul meets David for the first time twice. So I'm not sure why that is. That also leads me to believe that these books of Samuel and Kings couldn't have been written just by one person. It was probably a conglomeration of stories that were written. Maybe they were the historians of the people, especially by the time they had a king. They probably had historians, and so it's probably a collection of Samuel's role in establishing the kingdom. Perhaps, I don't know. So there really are two stories in the Old Testament that tell how Saul first met David, and that's the way it reads. He first met David, and then wait a second, you're reading later. He first met David. Wait a second. I already read and studied where Saul met David in a different way. But anyway, one of the stories about how Saul first met David was he needed someone to play music that would soothe him. Um, he had depression. He had anxiety. I know when I'm really sick, when I first started having attacks with kidney stones, um, yeah, it was so much pain. I just didn't want to deal with it. I just wanted to go away. Um, Part of me thinks that as we age, we better deal with pains than we do when we're younger. But I first started having uh, kidney stone problems in 1994. Well, 1994 was the first time I knew what those pains were, and they were bad. And I would just listen to the same CD over and over. I'd lay in bed. I'd take my pain pills, but I can't take a lot of pain pills because they kind of have the opposite effect on me. Where some people talk about taking pain medicine, it knocks them out. It makes me terribly, terribly alert, and I'm just like whoo, and I just can't sleep. So, and kidney stone pain is pretty severe. Uh, the strongest pain medicine just really doesn't help. I'm sure it helps, but it doesn't feel like it at that time. I remember when I was a professor at SFA in Nacogdoches, I had a really bad episode. In fact, I was in the emergency room a couple times within that week. And um, good news is the doctor I had there was very liberal with his prescription. Uh, Give me bottles of 120 pain pills. You know, I only use them for what they're for. But at one point, I was in so much pain that I called a friend of mine in Houston who's a pharmacist, and I said, "I'm having a really difficult time, and I have this big bottle of pain pills, and the doctor's prescription says take two to three times a day. But when you read, that's more than you're supposed to take." So I called my friend who's a pharmacist and said, "What's the most of these pills I could take without killing myself?" I mean, that's the place where I was. So uh, I know what being very anxious and very depressed feels like, because the times when I've been sick, specifically in a lot of pain, I kind of get there as well. And I've also had to deal with some other things. When I first started having my kidney stone problems, and I'd be down with that. That was also uh, the part of my life where I began coming out to myself, to the place that I could admit, you know, this is who I am. This is who I'm meant to be. And it took me like 8 years just wrestling through that. So I had that going on as well. So I can understand where music was necessary to help soothe Saul, because when I'm in a deep, dark, anxious, depressed state, music is what I do. I'll sit in my recliner, either the recliner in my office or the recliner downstairs in my living room, and turn on soft music. Sometimes contemporary Christian music, but when I'm really down, that doesn't always do it for me. Sometimes what I turn to is smooth jazz with no vocals. So I do have a lot of CDs over here on my shelf that are all instrumental. When I was a classroom teacher teaching fifth, sixth, and seventh grade, I often had uh, uh, soft music playing in the background, nearly 24/7. Um, there's probably funny stories about that and things that happened, but that's not part of what we're doing today. But anyway, so David was brought before Saul to play the harp, and I assume David sang and other things. And in a few minutes, I'll pick up my book, Deep and Wide, and go over some of the passages that I chose to focus on in First Samuel. Um, I find the whole Saul and David relationship interesting, especially with their families. And if you study there, there's connection between David and Saul and Jonathan's family for a long time. So their families became very interwoven in multiple ways. So as the Bible describes David, though, David was probably average in size, probably not overtly masculine in appearance. If you want to use the word masculine, I have difficulty with the word masculine and feminine because those are contrived words and they mean different things in different cultures, and they have meant different things at different time periods. So it's masculine and feminine are not solid terms because they're impacted by culture and time and lots of other things. So they're not real terms. We use them quite freely, but they're not real concrete terms. They're extremely subjective and have changed so much over time that it just doesn't go. But anyway, so if we want to use the word masculine as we use it today and apply it to then, here's Saul, big, tall, handsome, forceful man, taller than everybody else, very masculine. David was average, probably softer features, not that masculine, but was very smart. Well, I would think he did some stupid things, but uh, as a smart man, was able to access all of his resources, not just his might, his muscles. Although some of the description of David is he probably was a very attractive man. If you want to use the word beautiful, a beautiful man. You know, we sometimes say beautiful is for ladies, handsome is for men, but no, it works. You can say, oh, that's a handsome woman. But you can say a man is beautiful. You can say a woman is beautiful. And so we see in 1 Samuel the story of how the kings came to be. We see some of the interplay. Um, uh, Saul turned out not to be the best leader for the people, and so um, God spoke to Samuel, or Samuel heard God's voice, or Samuel thought he heard God's voice, uh, uh, saying that you need to warn Saul that he's not doing what he needs to do, and he didn't listen, did not change. So Samuel anointed someone else to be the next king, David. As it turns out, David married one of Saul's daughters. And that's a whole other story that I've probably talked about in other places and probably will talk about again. Um, so even though we say the monarchy started with Saul, then it broke, and then we went with a different family, because of David's entanglements and connections with Saul's family, he kind of became Saul's family because he was married to Saul's daughter. Um, in the record, we find where David married 7 times. There's no evidence that he had relations with 6 of those 7 women. It does infer or lead us to believe that David had no relations with his wife, uh, Michal or Michal, whatever her name is, who was the daughter of Saul. And Saul was angry at Jonathan's close relationship with David and was upset that David and Jonathan were so close, and that David and his daughter, whom he gave him in marriage, were not close. In fact, there's a scripture where David's coming back into town and dancing and celebrating because they've had victory in war, and he's dancing and in a way that might not be construed as totally masculine. And so uh, his wife, and I believe at that point he had a long period of time he was only married to the one woman, because he had Jonathan and Jonathan's sister. His wife was the connection to the family, but she wasn't there for his physical needs. David's coming back into town and he's dancing and he's having a good time. And I've seen even depictions of, the wealthy and the leaders, the males did wear jewelry. They would have had pierced ears, especially the younger ones. Saul probably not, but I can imagine David wore some jewelry. And so she was looking at him and she was upset with him. I can almost see her yelling, "Get in this house! Get in here! Stop acting like that in front of the people!" Because she was uh, um, the wife of this man, and eventually she was the wife of the king. And she says, "You're being undignified. That is not." And of course, she didn't speak English. So when we're saying what she said, realize these people did not speak English, and they did not speak 1611 King James English. This, "You're being undignified." And his response to her was, "Who are you talking to?" And you got to remember the culture. He was the man. The wife didn't talk to the man that way and say, "Who are you talking to?" And he also really, I mean, if he was not physically attracted to her or even interested in her, marriage back then was for uh, sealing contracts, making connections. Uh, I can almost see Saul thinking, it says, "Well, if I give my daughter to him, then I will be his father-in-law, so he won't harm me. He won't do anything against me." You know, to think that. I mean, we have uh, uh, notable. I hate to call this person a political person, but they're very political. But they were not elected. But attacking and doing very terrible things to their own trans child, and it's like, yeah. So there probably had to be this sense that, okay, we would do some protection here because we're going to have this contract or this connection. But Jonathan looked at her and said, uh, "Who are you talking to? You think this is undignified? You haven't seen anything yet." Uh, uh, the gospel ensemble at Resurrection Metropolitan Community Church used to sing a song. Oh, oh, I probably heard them sing it 3 times over the last 20 years. Uh, uh, I'll be more undignified than this. And I love that song. And I imagine, and the message of the song is, you know, don't tell me I'm undignified in the way I worship and pray. Because if you think this is undignified, you've not seen anything yet. And so I imagine that with David. And I almost imagine David being upset with her and said, "I'm staying out here dancing, but when I get home, you better not be there. Like, how dare you?" I almost see that as his last straw with her. It's like, you're my wife. It's just like, at this point, she was probably bitter because, she was his wife. But since he would not lie with her, obviously she didn't have any children. And so a woman that didn't have any children, it's like, man, there's something wrong with you, because they assume that if you're female and there's a male around and they're your husband, and they're going to lie with you. So if you got one and he's not even going to do that, then you have that to deal with. So let's look and see what it is that I have written about First Samuel in my book, Deep and Wide. That's my chronological study of the Bible, which I'm kind of following that order here. Sometimes I'm going by what's here, sometimes not. I think I probably should. So if you're following along in this devotional, I have First Samuel, and I retitled it "The Beginning of the Monarchy." It was written around 950 BCE. Author is unknown. And I have us studying 1 Samuel between February 25th and March 2nd. So I have a few devotionals picked out that I did. It starts out talking about Eli. Eli was the priest, the judge, and leader of Israel. And it would have been expected that one of his sons would carry on and be the next leader, but they were all terrible, terrible, terrible men. They weren't honorable. And um, a lady in the community named Hannah had been praying and praying and praying to have a child. And she said, if God would just bless me with a child, I will give him to God, physically give him to God. So when she gave birth to a boy named Samuel, and when he got old enough to serve in the temple, she took him to the priest Eli and said, I promised God that I would give him to his use. And, had it not been for the gift of Samuel to Eli as a quasi son, Eli's ministry probably would have been totally tarnished and sad forever because his own sons were so terrible. So we get into that. So we see the beginnings of Samuel. So, it's kind of like, so the book starts out with telling us the story of Samuel. So it's probably called First Samuel more because it's the story of Samuel and Samuel's influence more than it is the story of what Samuel did. And so Samuel then became the leader of the Israelites, but they didn't want Samuel, they wanted a king. And so he kept um, uh, being pressured. Even today we fall prey to peer pressure. And so we talk about that. You know, um, it's kind of like here's a quote I have on page 120. Yesterday's luxuries become tomorrow's needs. The danger of always needing more, 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 more. So Saul was 30 years old when he became king. He was taller than anyone else, and um, I understand that. I know whenever I've been at a church and it's time to get a new preacher, everybody has in their mind what they want. They want a tall, good looking man, usually. It's only been recently that female preachers have been allowed or ordained in many, many denominations. But um, I know when I've been part of a church that's actively seeking a new preacher, um, they tell their bishop or their superintendent what they meet with the board. I've been on boards of churches when that's happened, and you share with them the type of candidate that you're looking for, and it's always you're looking for a man uh, in their mid to late 30s because you want a young man who's going to grow with the church. You don't want an old man who's so set in their ways that they're not willing to grow with the people. And every church, as far as here I'm in the last chapters of my life, but every church always tends to have more old people than young people, and every church I've been part of has said, well, what are we going to do to attract the younger people? And one of the ways is having a younger, hipper preacher. So that's what they were wanting with Saul. Samuel went out to find the replacement for Saul, and he would go out and said, come back and pray, God, no one stands out. And that's when God had to teach Samuel a lesson. And that lesson was, man, and we'll say mankind, humans, people look on the outward appearance, but God looks at the inside. What are the motives? How is the heart? How are the hands? Are their hands clean? Is their heart pure? And so he eventually is drawn to David, and he anoints David to be the next king. And so David had to be aware of that, I guess. But he didn't go in and just immediately try to take over. There are a couple for February 29th, which is a leap year. So if you're reading this book, and it's not leap year, and you skip over February 29th, you'll miss a very good devotional that I have written for February 29th. And this gives one of the stories of how Saul first met David. It's like he says, Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the harp. He speaks well and is a fine looking man, and the Lord is with him." So, he was a good looking man. He wasn't taller than everybody else, but he was a pretty man, I would say. So anyway, February 29th goes on and really talks about the two different stories. Now, when we get into 1 Samuel 18 and 20, we see a couple of things. I truly believe that Jonathan and David were very, 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 very close friends. This one scripture, now remember, these people didn't speak English, but 1 Samuel 18, 1 and 4. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. Well, this becoming one in spirit is a metaphor throughout the Bible and throughout literature of that time and since for becoming one person and being united in the physicality of human love. So whether that's the type of love they had or not, I don't know for sure. Just like anyone who would say, "Oh, Larry, how dare you say that?" Well, no one else knows for sure that it was not. But I tend to believe that it was that type of deeper love, true love. Further evidence to that is how angry Saul got with his son Jonathan. And he attacks Jonathan's mother by saying, "You are a son of a perverse and rebellious woman. Don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you?" That sounds like it came right out of the year 2025 with some man telling his son that he's just discovered is gay, and he's knows who the boyfriend is, and said, "You have shamed and defiled yourself with that boy, and you are a shame to your mother and her family." So anyway, so you can read in that March 1st if you want to get more into that. Whether or not we today think Jonathan was gay, it seems that King Saul thought his own son was gay. He basically had an outburst and called Jonathan a pervert who ashamed himself with David and shamed his mother and family. In biblical times, it does not seem that there was any issue for men having multiple sexual partners. The only thing that seemed to be forbidden was having sex with the wife of another Israelite, for that defined adultery. Saul and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men died together that same day. So Saul and his 3 sons that he claimed as his sons of his lineage, including Jonathan, died. We will later find that David cares for Jonathan's son. I almost think that Jonathan's son must have had some sort of deficits, autism, mental challenges, physical challenges, but we read early on where Jonathan and David, while they were expressing their love for each other, to include a promise and allegiance to protect and love each other's family. If one of them was gone, the other one would make sure that their families were okay. And Jonathan and David did honor that, and you will see where uh, David took Jonathan's son, who had some difficulties, into his own home. Which by that time, you know, the way the king thing went. Okay, Saul and all of his sons died, so this son of Jonathan may have been next in line to the throne, but David was king at that time, and actually David was the son-in-law of Saul, so that could have also been his right to that. So, um, in theory, he loved Jonathan's son as if he was his own son, but technically he was his uncle. Okay. Well, if you've enjoyed this content, I've gone way longer than I normally do on my Bible podcasts that come out midweek. But if you like this, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for watching.